Okay, so welcome to the deep dive. Today, we are going to do a deep dive into something that is, I think, really, really important and has a lot of relevance today. And that is the playbook of Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orban and what it might tell us about the resilience of democratic institutions, especially as we look at the U.S.
Yeah, absolutely. And it really is more than an academic exercise, right?
Yeah.
We are dissecting a case study of how a democracy can be transformed step by step. And the goal here is to understand those steps and the underlying principles because recognizing these patterns, I think, is vital in understanding what's going on today.
Yeah, absolutely. And what makes our source for today so valuable is that it really provides a unique perspective.
Mm.
We were looking at some analysis from Coda Story that
Hmm.
really draws on the expertise of John Shattuck.
Oh, fantastic.
And what makes Shattuck's perspective so valuable is that he witnessed this firsthand. As the former president of Central European University in Budapest, this liberal institution built on, open inquiry, he saw how Orban's actions directly impacted academic freedom and led to the university being forced out of the country.
Right. He was on the ground. Yeah,
Yeah. So he wasn't just observing from afar, he was in it.
exactly.
So, okay, so let's get into it. How did Hungary, a country that seemed to really embrace democracy after the fall of the Berlin Wall,
Yeah.
how did it end up on this path?
Well, you're right. The early 90s in Central and Eastern Europe, I mean, there was so much optimism.
Yeah.
There was a widespread belief that liberal democracy and free markets had triumphed. It felt like a new era, and in many ways it was.
Yeah.
But the transition from communism was not exactly seamless.
Right.
Hungary, like many others, experienced pretty significant economic upheaval. You had state-controlled industries being rapidly privatized,
Yeah.
which often led to job losses and rising inequality. And then on top of that, you have Europe facing those huge refugee crises in later years.
Huh? So this period of initial hope and, kind of euphoria
Yeah.
was followed by these significant societal strains.
Exactly. And it was in this environment of economic insecurity and anxiety that we saw xenophobic and populist political movements begin to emerge.
Right.
People were looking for answers. They were looking for strong leadership. And Hungary really, I think, became one of the early and prominent examples of this kind of shift.
Yeah, yeah. And that brings us to Viktor Orban. Um, it's almost hard to believe now, but he started as a really prominent figure in the democracy movement, right? So how did that evolution happen? How did he go from democracy advocate to something else entirely?
Well, it's a fascinating story and, frankly, a cautionary tale.
Yeah.
Orban is a highly skilled political operator, and he has this really keen understanding of public sentiment.
Yeah.
And he effectively tapped into this sense of national grievance among Hungarians, this feeling that Hungary had been a victim of larger powers throughout its history.
Oh.
He also very skillfully exploited existing societal fault lines, particularly the tension between more nationally oriented rural populations and the more cosmopolitan urban centers.
So he really understood how to play on those divides.
Yeah, he did.
So what were the core messages that he used to galvanize support? What were the promises that he was making?
His messaging was very targeted and it was emotionally resonant. He consistently attacked the European Union,
Wow.
framing it not as a partner, but as a new form of external domination. He would even use rhetoric that echoed Cold War sentiments, almost a kind of us versus them mentality.
Right.
He also relentlessly demonized refugees,
Oh, wow.
painting them as this direct threat to Hungary's cultural and religious identity and invoking this idea of protecting Christian civilization.
And this is all sounding very familiar, of course.
Yeah, and echoing a sentiment we've heard elsewhere, he used the slogan, "Make Hungary great again," promising to restore national pride and strength. It's all about tapping into those deep-seated emotions. And he also very cleverly promoted the idea of a great Hungarian nation, appealing to the shared history and destiny, often at the expense of minority groups.
Right, right. And then there's this concept of illiberal democracy that he championed, which almost sounds like an oxymoron.
It is deliberately provocative.
Yeah.
He introduced this term to justify weakening democratic institutions after gaining power through democratic elections.
Wow.
So it's essentially the claim that democracy can be successful even without fully respecting the rule of law, an independent judiciary, a free press, as long as it reflects the will of the majority, as he defines it, of course.
Right.
It's a way to erode the foundations of liberal democracy while still claiming the mantle of democratic legitimacy.
Right. It's like having your cake and eating it too.
Exactly.
So, okay, we understand the rhetoric and the philosophy, but how did he actually do it? What were the specific, concrete steps that he took to consolidate power?
Okay, so this is where we see the mechanics of democratic backsliding in action. The first thing he did, even after a relatively narrow electoral victory, his party secured a supermajority in the Hungarian parliament.
So they won, but they didn't win by that much.
Right, and this wasn't solely due to the popular vote. Changes to the electoral system played a significant role.
Oh, interesting. So he kind of rigged the game a little bit.
You could say that. And that supermajority then allowed him to enact some pretty fundamental constitutional changes.
So he used a narrow victory to rewrite the rules of the game.
Exactly. That constitutional overhaul was the first domino. Then came the systematic dismantling of the independent media.
Right.
It wasn't just about shutting down critical outlets. The government strategically directed state advertising revenue to friendly media organizations, making them financially dependent and therefore more likely to toe the line. This creates a powerful self-censorship effect where even subtly critical voices risk being shut out.
Right.
Through various regulatory measures and consolidating ownership in the hands of loyalists, they gained control of something like 85% of the media landscape.
Wow, 85%. That's a huge amount of control.
It's staggering. Imagine the impact of that on public discourse and the ability to hold power to account.
Yeah, it's like having a stranglehold on the flow of information.
Wow.
Wow. What about the judiciary? That's supposed to be the bulwark against executive overreach, right?
Right. Well, Orban systematically undermined the judiciary as well. They expanded the Constitutional Court and then appointed numerous loyalist judges, effectively packing the court.
So stacking the deck.
Exactly. The government also lowered the retirement age for judges, forcing out many independent-minded jurists and replacing them with those more aligned with the ruling party.
So it's all about getting your people in.
It is. And then, of course, they limited the court's jurisdiction, and the rewritten constitution further curtailed its power to challenge government actions.
So they basically defanged the judiciary.
They did. And it sounds like he also cultivated a specific type of economic support as well.
Yeah, he fostered the growth of an oligarchy, right?
Right, a small group of politically connected individuals and businesses who benefited enormously from non-transparent government contracts and privatization deals.
And this is often funded by EU grants, right?
Exactly. And these individuals in turn provided significant financial and media support to his regime, creating this powerful and mutually beneficial relationship. Now, the EU did eventually suspend some of these funds due to concerns about corruption and the rule of law, but the initial influx really helped solidify this network.
Wow, so he created this whole system of patronage and reward.
He did, and he didn't just stop at the government and the economy. He went after civil society organizations as well.
Yeah, so any organization that was receiving funding or support from international sources, especially the US or Europe.
Right, they were labeled as foreign agents,
Oh, wow.
creating this climate of suspicion and intimidation.
And making it very difficult to operate, I imagine.
Exactly. It made it difficult for them to operate effectively, and it really eroded public trust in these organizations. Critics of the government faced harassment, and academic freedom within universities was increasingly restricted.
And this brings us back to the Central European University, right?
It does. The fact that a university dedicated to open inquiry and funded by an international philanthropist was essentially forced to relocate after years of pressure really highlights the extent of this crackdown.
Yeah, and the timing of the CEU's departure following Trump's election and his public endorsement of Orban is really striking.
Absolutely. It shows how international political alignments can really embolden authoritarian leaders and weaken the support systems for democratic institutions within a country.
Yeah, it's almost like a green light.
It can be. So given all of these tactics, John Shattuck identified 10 key rules that make up what we can call the Orban Playbook.
Yeah, so what are those core principles?
Okay, so the first rule is take over the party and enforce absolute internal discipline. Eliminate any possibility of dissent through pressure and intimidation. The second is build a base by appealing to fear and hate.
Right.
You brand minorities as dangers and opponents as enemies. The third is use disinformation and lies to justify your actions.
So control the narrative.
Exactly. And number 4, claim a sweeping mandate even without a majority. You assert that you represent the true will of the people.
Even if you didn't really win by that much.
Exactly. And the 5th rule is centralize power by destroying the civil service. Replace experienced professionals with loyalists.
Right.
You can see how each of these steps really builds on the others, creating this reinforcing cycle of power consolidation.
It's a very methodical approach.
It is. Then rule number 6, redefine the rule of law, making it subservient to executive decree.
So basically changing the meaning of the law?
Exactly. And rule number 7, dismantle all meaningful checks and balances. Take over the legislature, the courts, the media, civil society. We've seen how this was done in Hungary.
Yeah. And rule number 8, rely on oligarchs to supervise the economy. You reward them with state resources.
right? They become dependent on you and you become dependent on them. It creates a kind of closed loop. And rule number 9, ally with other authoritarians and support their efforts to undermine democracies.
So create a network of like-minded
It's
individuals.
exactly. And finally, number 10, convince the public that these actions are not only necessary but inevitable,
Oh, wow.
that resistance is futile.
So create a sense of hopelessness.
Exactly. And it's interesting because Steve Bannon famously said, Orban was Trump before there was Trump.
Yeah, that's a really telling quote.
It really underscores how influential Orban's approach has been on certain political movements, including the Magyar movement and things like Project 2025.
Right, and it's not just the U.S., is it? We're seeing echoes of this approach in other parts of Europe as well.
Unfortunately, yes. Shattuck points to Austria, where a far-right party with historical ties to extremist ideologies is a significant political force, and there's potential there for them to be involved in government in the future. Slovakia has also seen the rise of a nationalist government with rhetoric and policies that mirror some of Orban's. And even in some of the larger EU nations like Italy with Meloni,
Mm-hmm.
France with the National Rally, and Germany with the AfD,
Sure.
we've seen significant gains for far-right parties employing similar nationalist and anti-immigrant narratives, although the extent to which they fully embrace the Orban playbook varies. And democratic institutions in these countries have so far proven more resilient.
Yeah, Italy under Meloni is an interesting case because while her party has roots in the far right, she's taken a somewhat more moderate stance on certain EU and international issues since taking power.
Right, that's a really critical nuance. The playbook isn't always applied wholesale, and the constraints of international alliances, economic realities, and domestic opposition can all influence a leader's actions. In France, for example, while the National Rally has gained significant support, other political forces have so far managed to prevent them from gaining outright control. And in Germany, despite the AfD's electoral gains, there's still a pretty strong societal consensus against extremism rooted in their historical memory.
Right, right. And then you have Poland, which provides a really fascinating counterexample.
Right,
Right?
exactly.
For a while, it looked like they were on a very similar trajectory, but
Yeah.
recent elections have shifted the country back towards a more democratic path.
They have, and I think that's really important to note. The Polish experience, where a really broad coalition of opposition parties united to defend democratic institutions and ultimately unseated the ruling Nationalist Party, offers a powerful reminder that this slide towards authoritarianism is not inevitable.
Right.
Collective action and a strong commitment to democratic values can make a difference.
That's a really hopeful example.
It is. So when we look at the bigger picture, what are the key lessons we should take away from the case of Orban's Hungary? Well, one really clear takeaway is the power of populist movements. They often arise from legitimate grievances and periods of significant social and economic disruption.
Right, people are hurting. They're looking for answers.
Yeah. And democracies need to be able to understand and address these underlying concerns effectively, rather than allowing them to be exploited by those seeking to undermine democratic norms.
Absolutely. And the Hungarian experience, I think, really starkly illustrates that while authoritarianism might initially promise stability or a return to some perceived golden age,
Right.
it ultimately leads to the erosion of fundamental freedoms, increased corruption, and greater inequality. The long-term costs for a society are immense.
Yeah, it's a Faustian bargain.
It is.
Yeah.
Another crucial lesson, I think, is that the defense of democracy needs to be framed as a compelling and inclusive cause in itself.
Yeah.
You know, authoritarian leaders often try to monopolize national symbols and narratives. It's essential to reclaim those symbols to represent the core values of democracy: the rule of law, human rights, international cooperation.
Yeah, reclaim that narrative. Exactly. When those foundational democratic principles are weakened, it creates an opening for authoritarian models to gain traction. And as the Orban playbook shows, a key goal of such leaders is to weaponize the power of the state against their democratic opponents, using various means to silence dissent and create that atmosphere of resignation we talked about.
So how does all of this apply to the United States specifically? John Shattuck suggests that the U.S. has some inherent advantages in resisting this kind of democratic backsliding compared to Hungary. What are those factors?
Well, there are several factors that I think provide the U.S. with a degree of resilience. Its sheer geographic size and its incredible diversity are significant.
Yeah, the U.S. is a huge and very diverse country.
It is, and this diversity fosters dynamism and a range of perspectives that can make it harder for a single authoritarian vision to take root and dominate. The U.S. also benefits from a long-standing tradition of a vibrant civil society with tons of independent organizations and advocacy groups. While it faces its own challenges, the judiciary remains largely independent, and the media landscape, despite concerns about partisan bias and misinformation, is still comparatively free and diverse.
Right.
And of course, the U.S. Constitution, with its system of checks and balances and its protection of fundamental rights, provides a crucial legal framework for resisting government overreach.
Right. And it's also important to remember that in the last presidential election, no candidate won a majority of the popular vote.
That's true.
And public opinion polls consistently show significant divisions and relatively low approval ratings for political leaders.
Right, so that's a key indicator that a large segment of the population is not aligned with any single authoritarian agenda. We've also seen significant resistance to certain policies and actions through the courts,
Yeah.
as well as widespread grassroots mobilization and activism in defense of democratic principles. And let's not forget the historical context. The American identity is deeply intertwined with the struggle for democratic ideals and the resistance against tyranny.
Right. And there's also that ingrained American skepticism towards centralized power,
Absolutely.
that historical aversion to big government, which in some ways could act as a natural barrier to unchecked authority.
It could. So while the threats to democratic norms in the U.S. are real and need to be taken very seriously, the country possesses inherent strengths and a history of resistance that provide a foundation for pushing back against authoritarian tendencies.
And what does John Shattuck say about this? He uses a very interesting quote, doesn't he?
It does. He concludes his analysis by referencing Robert F. Kennedy's Ripple of Hope speech,
Right.
reminding us that even small, consistent acts of courage and resistance can eventually lead to profound change, even against seemingly insurmountable odds.
Yeah, that even small acts can have a big impact.
They can.
Yeah.
So to bring it all together, this deep dive into Viktor Orban's Hungary offers a really valuable and frankly essential framework for understanding the tactics and strategies employed to undermine democratic institutions.
Yeah.
It highlights the warning signs that we need to be aware of and underscores the enduring importance of vigilance and active engagement in safeguarding democratic principles.
So it's not just about understanding what happened in Hungary, it's about applying those lessons to our own contexts.
It is. And that leads to a really important question for you, our listener. As you reflect on the Orban playbook that we've discussed today, what specific actions, policies, or trends in your own community, in your own country, warrant a closer look?
Yeah.
What are the subtle ways in which democratic norms might be challenged or eroded? And what actions, however small, can you take to ensure that those ripples of hope continue to spread and strengthen democratic values?
So think about it and get involved.
Exactly.
All right, that's it for our deep dive today. Thanks for listening.
Thanks for having me.